As you are all aware, in this session, we are going to discuss Sustainable Development Goals. And we are very honored to have with us two very distinguished experts. Dr. P.K. Anand, who is currently with RIS, has served in the Government of India for very long years and has been heading the SDGs work program at the Niti Aayog before his superannuation. Dr. Anand is from the Indian Administrative Service, having experience of working in the Government of India and Government of Rajasthan. He is equipped with degrees of PhD in Economics, MSc in Physics, and MSc in Economics from the London School of Economics, and Fellow of the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. He is currently working as a visiting fellow in RIS and handling SDGs and cross-border development issues. Mr. Diego Palacios is the UN resident representative of the United Nations Population Fund. He was appointed as UNFPA representative to India and country director in Bhutan in February 2016. Prior to that, Mr. Palacios served as executive coordinator for the post-2015 development agenda, advising the UNFPA executive director from 2012 to 2014. So we have a very rich experience on the dais, and I hope you will. It would be a very interesting session. But before we proceed, let me briefly introduce you to why we think in RIS to be that SDGs are very important, and we have a very active work program at RIS. We have worked very closely with the government during the Rio Plus 20 process and in the process of evaluation of the Millennium Development Goals. Since 2015, our work program has expanded tremendously, starting from the third Conference on International Financing for Development, UNFFD3, at Addis Ababa. Subsequently, the UN Sustainable Development Summit in New York in 2015, when the SDGs were adopted. And thereafter, in the high-level political forum process in 2016 and 2017, where many countries have presented that their voluntary national reviews. We have worked very closely with the Niti Aayog, which is the nodal agency that is entrusted with overseeing the implementation of the SDGs in India, as well as the UN family in India. And we have organized large-scale national consultations on several key sustainable development goals. As you may know, India is a federal country, and for us, cooperative federalism is very important. So in each of these national consultations, we could have on board representatives from all the state governments in chalking out a plan for implementation of the SDGs in the next decade or so. We have covered almost all the important SDG goals, starting with SDG 2, that is on hunger, goal 3, that is on health, 4, that is on education, 5, gender, goal 6, that is on water and sanitation, goal 7 on energy issues, goal 8, employment, goal 9 on industry and innovation topics, goal 10 that covers inequality not only among the countries but also within the country, goal 12 that talks of sustainable consumption and production, goal 13 that covers climate change issues, goal 14 that covers ocean issues and blue economy, goal 15 covers ecosystem. However, at RIS, we take goal 17 very seriously. That covers global partnership issues, covering issues like South-South cooperation and triangular development cooperation. We look into issues that offer opportunities in multilateralism, despite the challenges that we see in recent times. Issues in the domain of finance and technology facilitation. The entire course on ITEC science diplomacy program currently is focused on this issue of how countries can come together in sharing knowledge for sustainable development all across. We have been leading the UN mandated technology facilitation mechanism, that was put forth as a joint proposal by India, Brazil, and France. And in days to come, both knowledge and finance, as I feel, would be key to the implementation of the SDGs globally. Without further ado, may I now request Dr. Anand to deliver his talk.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. I'll be talking on SDGs, and you are most welcome to raise any issue while the talk is going on, because I'm told it's more of an interactive session than one-way traffic. Before I take you to big picture, I'll take you to very big picture. This is when we are striving for money, power, whatever. We are running on a hedonic treadmill, and we feel that we are progressing. If you just see the time we are spending on, say, mobile phones, WhatsApp, and we thought once upon a time that this device will help us a lot. I'm not saying I'm not against it, I am also using it, but then at times happiness becomes relative. If your neighbors are having the same car which you are having, the relative happiness diminishes. So that's what's happening to us all. And within that framework, a question comes, economic growth or growth, what for? So in India, we say it should have inclusiveness. If you look at SDGs, SDGs say no one should be left behind. At the same time, sustainability is very important for us all. How? Because it's a program more linked to science diplomacy. I'll be touching upon heavily on one aspect of climate change. Before that, when we talk of economic growth, what are the macro determinants? If you see from the top right, physical labor, you see any person making some earnings through physical labor, you will find that his earnings are not much. If he has human capital, if he is educated, his earnings increase a bit. You add to it physical capital, say you give him a laptop or you give him a vehicle which he can drive as a driver, then daily earnings or annual earnings go up. If nations have trade openness, it's proved beyond doubt that, and instrument variables have also been used to prove it, that additional international trade adds to incomes on an average. Then R&D and technology is so much important for this session. And most of the gains which have come in the name of total factor productivity over last, say, 200 years can be partly attributed to these factors. If you see say, growth accounting, in earlier years when Solo model came in 1956, there was talk of K and L, physical capital and labor. Then somebody added A represents technology. So a lot of kick is coming through better technology. Then institutions are very important. We know all that, say, if we talk, say, in terms of UN as an institution driving SDGs, so institutions make a lot of difference globally and at national level also. So far as India is concerned, how we are looking at development, our Honorable PM says that if our intentions are good, so will be our policy. So intentions should be pious and proper and good. And when it happens, so will also be our destiny. So in Hindi, there is a rhyming that our niyat should be good. To have good niti means policy, and then we'll have good niyati. Same thing, I am writing it up, but in the first bit, I am giving one example. More than 2 years back, there was a lot of discussion on people getting subsidy under liquefied petroleum gas. And our Honorable PM made a call that give it up. You will generally see politicians coming and saying that I promise to give you this or that. So he came up and said, if you give up your subsidy. I'm not asking you to give up the gas connection. You continue to have the gas connection, but just give up the subsidy element out of it. Then for each person giving it up, one female in rural areas among the households below poverty line will be given a connection of LPG. In the process, 10 million households came forward to give up. And believe it, against 10 million, 30 million households have been given these connections. So you can see that when we talk in terms of SDGs, it may look like that this is an SDG on, say, energy, SDG 7. But at the back of it, the kind of health hazard it has. I just recall one lady having died a few days back. She was on ventilator. Precisely due to this reason that she was in a rural area cooking and in an environment which was generating a lot of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, and she could not make it through. Judicious use of natural and human resources, same thing which SDG 12, as Mr. Saha just said. We cannot wait for incremental changes. So we have to go for transformation with the use of, say, technology. Now, if we are talking of SDGs are interconnected, firstly, we all nations are highly interconnected. You cannot think of doing something here. Even if I don't talk in terms of flutter of a butterfly here and a tornado elsewhere, but still, it makes a lot of sense that we all are highly interconnected. As an example, this is the ozone hole. Just see, the size of North America is given at around, say, 24.8 million square kilometers. Against it, see the size of the ozone hole. I am told, and I was reading it yesterday also for some other purpose, that maybe things are improving. Maybe in 2017 the hole was not, the maximum size of hole was not of that size, which is a very good sign of success of the efforts being made over the years on CFCs and chlorine and bromine like that. But still, one has a look at it after 1990, broadly things worsened a lot. A question comes, how do we measure and what is an ozone hole? So there is a unit called Dobson unit. It's nothing but 1/100th part of a millimeter. And we measure ozone layer thickness by using this unit. I'll not just, if it's more than 220 units, we say there's, at that point there is no hole, otherwise there is a hole. This is a broad picture of 2014. You can see the colors which are not green, that shows the enormity of the problem. How do you measure it? Bring down the column of air at 1 atmosphere, 0 degree centigrade, measure it. If it is less than 220, you say this area as a whole, otherwise not. These are the 17 SDGs Mr. Saha has covered. Just linkages, if you have better road connectivity, you have more births attended by skilled personnel. Similarly, on access to electricity leads to higher levels of, so these are the regressions run across Indian states, and these are statistically significant. R square values are not very bright, but still 0.31 here is highly acceptable. Again, MDG performance of various states vis-a-vis economic growth. There is a positive correlation, and some of the big things which India has done in this, we are going to have, say, 6 million houses having basic facilities, trying to give employment to one person from each family, connecting balance out of 178,000 eligible habitations. We have reached 93% of this figure. A senior secondary school within, say, 5 kilometers, under Make in India to create jobs. I am leaving this presentation now for your use subsequently. I have spoken on LPG connections, electrification of balanced villages, and then very bold nationally determined contributions, very bold. You can see, to reduce emission intensity by 33 to 35%. And whole lot of others. I have not, because we have 1 hour only and we have to interact also, but you can make it out. On technology, 17.6, the last bit is when agreed upon. So I think it should have been drafted better and accepted better. There are gaps. R&D promotion is needed at the same time, and TRIP, because TRIPS to be honored, but at the same time, developing countries need to have technology to reach the technological frontiers. I'm not touching much upon finances. We may talk during the interaction. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you here this afternoon to have a meaningful, interesting conversation on the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure that every one of you have been exposed to information about the SDGs. But sometimes I feel that in the academia, I think that the treatment of the, for example, of the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, were not always part of those discussions. And I think that that was because the way the MDGs were framed was totally different from the approach that this time the international community had on the SDGs. My name is Diego Palacios, as it was mentioned. I am the representative of the United Nations Population Fund in India. Of course, when we speak about population, the place to be is India, of course. So I'm very glad to represent the UN office here in India and be with you this afternoon. My idea, what I was told, is basically that I will be giving you a short summary of the SDGs, particularly how they were designed, the main aspects and principles behind the SDGs, and of course, discuss a bit about the challenges for implementing the SDGs. In fact, as was read in my CV, I had the chance to witness myself the process of discussion for the formulation of the SDGs. I was advising my office in New York, my director in New York, on the SDGs. And as you probably know, the UN had a very important role in helping, assisting, facilitating the different states, the different governments in this process. So I was part of my agency with a group of 72 agencies. We established that what they call the technical support team, technical support team that was working with the governments in formulating the SDGs since 2011. 2012, and I probably could relate to you that behind any of these SDGs, the level of discussion, the level of contradiction sometimes, the level of negotiations that we had to go through in these 3 years to have finally agreed to this set of amazing goals for the planet. So I, behind the official representation, I could tell you many anecdotes involving the whole negotiation and the hot points of this negotiation that really, when you look at them, 17 is so simple, no? But behind doors, it was a very challenging process that really had to happen to have, you know, this very impressive set of planetary goals, and of course that was just the formulation. Imagine the challenges that we are having and experimenting for implementing the SDGs. So let me drive you through this very brief presentation on the SDGs. So again, this basically was a result of 3 years of negotiation that involved many stakeholders in this process. So you had governments, you had civil society, you had the private sector, you had groups of people, you know, the youth, the women's organizations, even the Vatican was playing a role in this process. Of course, Vatican is a state. And, you know, it was a very impressive participatory process that went through to have this final, you know, output and result. As I told you, there was an open group. Basically, there were about 60 countries represented in the open working group. And the open working group was the body through which these agreements were channelized, discussed, and they were discussing, you know, throughout, you know, these 2 years, very intensively, the content and the agreements that could be reached. And of course, we had the document, which is the document that, along with the goals and the targets, you will find very interesting to read the introduction to the document, to the SDGs, which really states and formulates that global vision for the humanity in the 4 or 5 main areas of the SDGs. I really recommend that reading, because it will really, beyond the particular, you know, goals and the targets, will give you the very broad view of what really the countries and the open working group was thinking when, you know, these apparently, you know, dispersed 17 goals will come together in terms of making the quality of life, particularly of those left behind, better into the future. So the agenda, really, the 2030 agenda is a plan of action. It doesn't have targets. We know we have a 15-year span to implement the SDGs, but this is a plan of action. No budget, of course. We'll discuss about the financial implications, but this is a plan of action for people, for the planet, and overall for prosperity. And perhaps the more interesting thing is that if you analyze the SDGs now and equate that to the MDGs, to the Millennium Development Goals, the process in which the SDGs were developed is totally different. In the case of the MDGs, a group of experts met in New York, and in a record time of 2-3 months, they came out with the MDGs. And frankly, I was at that time in the field, and what I saw is that the governments were not really willing to embrace the Millennium Development Goals, because for them, it was an outside process in which they didn't participate. If that was the position of the governments, imagine what the other groups were thinking about the MDGs, a creation of, you know, 5, you know, smart minds in New York that now they're going to push us to implement it. That's different in the SDGs. The SDGs was a very wide process in which everybody, every government, every civil society, every outlet had the chance to participate. And here, of course, you know, the outcome of the SDGs will have to be approved by the states, 193 states in the world, but actually it represented the commitment, the agreements of many parties, including the private sector, including, you know, the religious sectors. I myself participated in several meetings with different religious, you know, denominations. And in fact, you know, it's a product of humanity, what we are seeing in terms of the MDGs, and that really is a very striking difference to what happened with the MDGs. The SDGs really are participatory, collaboratively by governments involving many sectors in this process. So here you have the 17 goals, 169 targets. If you see them in a separate mode, the first question that you will ask is how we are going to implement this, because it covers everything. So basically, issues related to the social sector or human development. Some of these were reflected already in the MDGs. And I think here the intention was to take on board those areas of the MDGs that were not implemented. So what we call the pending agenda from the MDGs would basically deal with health, basic health, including family planning and reproductive health, which is one of the areas in which we work in UNFPA, plus education, gender issues, gender equality, hunger, poverty, etc. But to those social or human development goals, a new set of goals were added that were not in the previous framework. Those related to economic growth, and particularly those related to the issues of sustainability. And along with them, with these three big areas of concern, the whole issue of the means of implementation, which is critical: funding, technology, trade, human rights, and the law and justice. I think those are, in a sense, the big four blocks underpinning the whole proposal for the SDGs. That's what I said. So if you see, the SDGs are sectoral, of course, the ones that deal with agriculture, health, etc., but you have those goals that are cross-sectoral, which means that, you know, in order to achieve results, several sectors will have to come together and deliver together. Let's say you cannot speak about only reaching what it was implied in the previous presentation. Economic growth has a value per se, certainly, but if you only concentrate in achieving, you know, higher economic growth, then you will be impacting, of course, the environment if the consumption and the production patterns remain the same. So in order to achieve, you know, the goals in the SDGs, you need to consider that some of these goals will have to be achieved at the same time and with the striking balance in the implementation of these activities. But I'd like to perhaps mention the three principles that really are behind this. And these are the ones that you will see with more clarity if you read the introduction to the SDGs. One is the principle of universality, which means that the SDGs should be applied to every country independently of the level of economic and social development. The SDGs are for every country in the world. Meanwhile, the MDGs previously were only applied to the South. So the responsibilities now of North and South are very clearly reflected in the SDGs as we see them. So that's one thing. Secondly, the second principle is the principle of not leaving anybody behind and reaching the furthest first. So that means that, you know, when we measure GDP, and we measure economic growth, and when we measure health, etc., sometimes we are measuring, and that happened when the countries reported on the MDGs, we are reporting on averages. So there were countries that actually achieved most of the MDGs, but actually when you begin to look at them internally in the country, you realize that there were a striking difference between those who have more and those who have been left behind. So now the proposal of the SDGs is that we, have committed to ensure that everybody, irrespective of age, sex, religion, race, ethnicity, etc., will be achieving the same level of results than the rest of the country. So this is a very important principle and calls for a more detailed, a more specific definition and implementation of policies that will really be aiming at ensuring that the quality of life of the poorest segments of the population will be changed. So this is a difference from the MDGs, and of course this is a fundamental principle in many countries, particularly in some regions where you have a very striking internal economic, social differences between segments of the population. And finally, of course, out of this is the issue of to implement the SDGs, we need to have an integrated approach. Some of the previous graphs were showing that if you want to reach higher levels of electricity coverage, of course you have to deal also with some of the social conditions that will enable people to have access to these services. So the SDGs are integrated, and the big challenge, believe me, is how the countries have to be prepared to implement these SDGs also in a more integrated approach. Because actually, if you see, many of the governments now, they deal with education through the Ministry of Education, they deal with environment with the Ministry of Environment, but among them, there's very little discussion, there's very little integration, there's very little conversation, and I think that's the biggest challenge for implementing such an integrated approach as the SDGs. So in terms of planning, then, besides what I've mentioned, I think we need, from the experience of the MDGs and the work that the UN does, I think there are about 6 principles, 6 elements that we need to see when implementing the SDGs. One is, of course, the ownership by not only the government, but also the sectors in that particular country. And I think that's fundamental. Of course, the government has a leadership role, but also the private sector and the non-governmental sector will have to really commit to implement the SDGs, of course, given the spaces to be doing so. Secondly, what I was saying is the whole government approach. It's not that the Ministry of Education is doing well, but the Ministry of Health is doing very bad, so in average we are fine. No, I think both of them need to come together and work together to be able to deliver on those commitments. The goals are interconnected. If you advance on economic growth, I think there's a peril or there's a danger to have a negative impact in environment, so you need to bring these 2 sectors together. When you enhance the capacities in terms of human capital, you need to ensure that that human capital have access to gainful employment, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a tremendous interconnection between the goals, and I think the governments will require policy integration across these sectors to be able to deliver on the SDGs. It's a broad coalition that's needed. I've already discussed that. And financing, of course, now, particularly for developing countries, is not an issue of waiting for the developed countries to come and provide the funding to work on the SDGs. We need to mobilize national funds. Governments have to collect better through taxes, given that the disparity also, social disparity, economic disparity, everybody has to contribute, but particularly the resources, the financial resources to be able to implement the SDGs will have to come from the same governments. So, and of course, still the assistance to development is important, but they have to make a big effort to bring and to ensure that they collect the necessary financial appropriations to be able to implement the SDGs. And finally, and I think this is very important, and it's at the core of the SDGs, is the issue of innovation and technology, which I think will underpin, with new ideas, with new technologies, the whole issue of implementing the SDGs. The case of India, it's fundamental. India, because of its size, we just were discussing with Dr. Anand, about the size of India, and I was telling him that by 2065, 68, India will be stabilizing its population at about 1.7 billion people. And of course, India, for achieving the global SDGs, is very important, because if you analyze each and every goal or each and every target, India will be contributing with at least 30% of the achievement in terms of the global achievement of the SDGs. So India, of course, is fundamental for the global achievement of the MDGs. Still in India, I mean, there are a lot of progress made in the last years, but still population, the proportion of population living under poverty, it's important. Of course, new programs, a lot of funding has been made available. Some of the programs were already mentioned. Social programs, technological programs, innovation programs are there. So we expect that all that is being invested in India currently will certainly make a difference in terms of achieving the SDGs. Perhaps the issue in India is that India has the biggest youth population in the world, 360 million young people, which could really be the driving force for the SDGs if and only if the correct investment policies are made to ensure that they, are the new generation driving the SDGs in the country. So I think with the collective journey that we initiated in 2016, we need to have everybody on board, and certainly it will be fundamental to meet the goals and the targets, but particularly looking at those sectors of society that have, not the same conditions and situations that we all enjoy. And of course, in this room that we enjoy in terms of studying, in terms of reaching, in terms of becoming prepared, that same, situation would have to be extended to cover other sectors in our societies. So thank you very much.
So we are open for questions.
Check. Yeah. Hi, my name is Arya Das. I'm from the NYU group as well. My question is regarding that this whole 2030 agenda is very ambitious and has a lot of high-reaching and sort of ideal goals as well. You did mention towards the end of your slides that that 30% of the goals can be met by India and India's progress. My question stems from how do you measure some of these goals? Because some of them are so ambitious that statistically to measure them or to have an objective measure of them, it seems some of them seems hard to define. And since the goals were sort of sometimes intentionally kept idealistic, that there seems to be very difficult to have a common definition or a common standard or common objective measurement of the same, which I think will get problematic, especially as we get closer to 2030, because then on different subjective standards, some countries can say, yes, we've met the goals, or we're close to meeting the goals, while others can say, no, that's not an objective enough measurement. So how do you propose, as we go closer to 2030, that what would be a good way to go about coming up with these objective standards of measurement of these various goals?
I think that that's a very interesting question. Thank you. Because I really didn't refer in the presentation the issue of measurement. Actually, that has been something that, you see, the SDGs were approved in 2015 in September. But before that, even, the UN was supporting the countries to discuss the issue of monitoring and the data needed and the indicators needed to measure progress as we implement the SDGs. And actually, if I'm not wrong, there are about 198 indicators that will measure the 17 goals and the 169 targets. And these indicators really are indicators that have been agreed with the government. So every country reporting, and I will refer also to the reporting of the SDGs a bit later, that will be reporting on the SDGs will be using a similar set of indicators to be able to report back to a new mechanism for reporting and monitoring the implementation of the SDGs. So these 198 were divided in 3 tiers. One tier was indicators that every country is collecting and have been collecting for the SDGs, for the MDGs. For example, maternal mortality rates, or let's say child mortality rates, or rates of vaccination, or school enrollment. Those were indicators that have been tested and tried, and every country is collecting. And I'm not referring here about the quality of that data, but countries are collecting those data. So that was tier 1. In that tier, it was easy because countries had already the statistical systems, surveys, administrative records, already there. Census also data. The tier 2 of indicators were indicators that were there, but still some adjustments would have been done to enable them to measure these new, more complex approaches in terms of the results. And that discussion was finalized in 2016, and they agreed to discuss and accept, include these tier 2 indicators that were a bit more problematic because some countries were not really aligned, were not discussing. And I'm referring here, for example, on how you measure agricultural production, for example, the issues related to economic data is more or less standard, but when you deal with environmental data, for example, how do you measure impact on rainforests, et cetera, that's more difficult. Data indicators are there, but still some countries find difficulty on getting that data. And the more difficult part was the tier 3, which were new indicators that were trying to be adopted and by the countries. And still there are some indicators in that tier that still need to be further discussed to be able to report on that. So if things go well, in the next year or so, many countries, or the majority of countries, will have data even for tier 3, hopefully, but will have data enough to report on tier 1 and tier 2 indicators. So that's the plan. And I think what you are mentioning really is very important because it will certainly avoid that situation in which countries are using many indicators, different indicators to measure the same things in different ways. And that's certainly what we try to avoid in terms of trying to measure in a proper way by adopting, accepting indicators that will be the case. Useful to measure the SDGs. In the case of India, India has a very strong statistical system. India has been running population censuses, for example, for about 140 years. And of course, administrative data is becoming better and better. So in the case of India, I think that India is doing very well. Other countries with less possibilities, with less statistical tradition might have difficulties. But in every case, each country will have now to report back on the SDGs to the high-level policy committee on implementation of the SDGs. And actually, India reported this past year, in 2017, voluntarily on the situation on the SDGs, and there's a full report that I'm sure if some of you will be interested, I think the Institute will be able to provide you with that information.
Hi, I'm Eric. I'm also with the NYU group. Thank you for the presentation. As you mentioned, the global achievement SDGs depends heavily on India, and given India's large youth population, I'd assume that SDG 4 is a priority. Can you briefly describe the challenges in achieving SDG 4 here in India, specifically education for girls, and what efforts can be done to overcome those challenges?
You see, when we talk of, say, education of girls in India, recently there's a lot of emphasis on a program called Save Girl Child, Educate Girl Child. It's Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. That's one intervention. In the earlier phase, we were focusing on enrollment. And we have achieved more or less 100%. Technically speaking, if you go by the indicator, the values may be even more than 100 because the denominator has the population in that range, say 6 years to 7 years. Numerator has girls actually going to class 1, of whom some may be below 6 years and some may be above 7 years. So numerator may be more than the denominator. So that's one area. Definitely there were issues of enrollment, but that part has been taken care of. Now there are issues of learning outcomes. Now the focus of the government is on learning outcomes. In between we had an act, Right to Education Act, which emphasized a lot on larger coverage and which mentioned in terms of comprehensive continuous evaluation, CCE. So that meant that it should not happen that we wait for annual examinations or half-yearly examinations. In certain areas, it was interpreted as if there are not to be any evaluations, and it was interpreted as no detention policy. A child cannot be detained right up to class 8 into the class in which child is studying. So you need to keep on promoting irrespective of learning outcomes. But that was not so, that was not the spirit of the act. But now if you have a look at the numbers are telling that things are improving, because this is having indicators linked to 2030. In fact, what Palacio was telling there, I would like to add one point to that there are many goals and many indicators and many targets which are linked to 2020 to reduce accidental deaths by 50% by 2020. And goals, 17 goals and 169 targets were accepted by all the 193 countries in September 2015. But they were given flexibility to have their own indicators. So far as India is concerned on, say, this goal, India has prepared its indicator. It had placed in public domain, taken open feedback. Now a proposal has gone to the cabinet for approval of indicators. But at the same time, when we talk in terms of indicators, I do agree with the gentleman who had asked the earlier question that enormity of indicators creates problems. If you have too many, today if I go to UN ECOSOC site, I'll encounter 244, of which 232 are individual, some are repetitions, as many as that. So that creates problems, but at the same time, there can be something called thematic indicators. If I come back to the indicators he was talking on, say, health sector. If I take under 5 mortality rate, now under 5 will cover neonatal. Neonatal deaths are deaths within first 6 weeks. Then infant mortality within first year. So these are covered under 5. Then mother's health is also covered, because if mother is not healthy, then naturally child may not survive up to the age of 5. So there may be a talk on evolving a smaller set of thematic indicators that which are, say, 20, 25, 30. I have not evolved. We are working on it in RIS to evolve thematic indicators also, so that broadly nations can have a look at those indicators. But certainly SDG 4 is very, very important, like SDG 3. Thank you. You would like to ask?
Hi, my name is Isabel, and I'm also a student at NYU. I'm also interning right now at the UNDP in New York, and the unit I work in tries to integrate private sector actors and corporations into development projects to achieve the SDGs. So my question is, what are the efforts done here in India to integrate and engage with the private sector and Indian corporations on development projects to achieve the 2030 agenda?
You see, in India, we have parallelly, not because of SDGs, an act had come which talks in terms of corporate social responsibility. And broadly, in very broad terms, I don't want to define it, 2% of the large units making profits is to be spent by them on certain areas which are specified under the act. Now, a large number of CSR efforts by private sector are happening in various areas related to SDGs. Maybe opening up of a health facility, of a school, linking a road to a village next to a factory like that. So that's one effort which is taking place. Secondly, as was told by Mr. Sabyasachi also, when we organized our various national consultations, I was working in NITI Aayog, he has been in RIS. Now I have come to RIS. So we were involving private sector also. They were also coming, especially say if you have a look at SDG 8 on growth and then 9 on infrastructure. So these are the areas where they had come, they had spoken also what efforts they are making. And the kind of challenges which are there. I would like to just give one example that, say, length of roads constructed per day. If I look at national highways, more than 12 or 13 kilometers per day. If I look at rural roads, I was discussing yesterday with my successor, I was handling that program earlier, more than 130 kilometers a day. So these are the large interventions, and for the first sector, government, even if it's in a position to spend money, it will not have that kind of money, that much of money. It needs to borrow, involve private sector. There have to be various arrangements like PPP or EPC, etc. So that way, the sectors are being involved. And for them, when we interact with them, they feel that CSR is a very good initiative. At the same time, if you look at 2030 targets and the requirements for a country like India, whatever is being done is not adequate to reach that ballpark figures by 2030. We need to do a lot more.
Thank you very much. WPS Sidhu also with the NYU group. It's been said already several times, I think Diego mentioned that in many ways the success of the Millennium Development Goals was the result of the success of one country, China. And it's said the same way that if the Sustainable Development Goals are to succeed, it'll be because of one country primarily. Of course, other countries are going to play a role as well, and that is India. With that background perspective, I have 3 sets of specific questions, which would be interesting to get your perspective on. First, this notion of all of government, as well as all of society. You already had a question about the private sector, but what about the role of civil society? What about the role of states? How is that being manifested, particularly from the from the location of NITI Aayog. NITI Aayog was always a federal sort of structure in that sense. Second, it's been estimated that for SDGs to be implemented effectively, you need to raise funds to the level of 2 to 3 billion a year. What is the Indian assessment of the annual funds, and what has been the record of raising those funds until now? What has been the success of that? Third, very interestingly, you talked about, you mentioned the target of 100 million jobs by 2022. So just looking at it out from 2018, that's roughly about 20 million jobs a year. And again, roughly again, that's 1.5 million jobs a month. How many jobs has India been creating until now? And based on that record, is there a certainty that looking forward, India will be able to generate 20 million jobs a year from between now and 2022? Thank you.
I think you have partly answered also, because I totally agree with you that success of MDGs was attributable to China, and for MDGs, and for SDGs, India is a very critical element. To be very frank, it's a very dubious distinction for a country that unless you do it globally, it will not move. So one is not very proud of this fact, but I do agree it is a fact. I come to the 3 points which you have raised. All of government or all of, so here, so far as civil society is concerned, right from the first consultation which we had held on 9th February 2016 on SDG 3 and on 10th on SDG 4, we have been involving CSOs, they have been participating, coming, and on top of it, a heartening feature is that independently also they have been organizing events, and I was honored to be attending many of these events exclusively organized by CSOs, where say 40, 50 or 100 come to the place of the consultation. Cooperative federalism by NITI Aayog and requirement of annual funds, there are various estimates, but I would not like to go into an estimate. But the numbers, if you have a look at it, the number of the kind of programs we are running, of course on infrastructure numbers are very impressive, and you can see that what was being done say in n number of years is now being done in 1 year. And I'm talking from the side of outcomes, not from the side of money also. That means I'm talking in terms of real rupee, deflated for inflation. I would like to add, say on SDG 2, National Nutrition Mission has come just now, 9,600 crore rupees saved. More than a billion, 1.5 billion kind. Now, this is just one intervention, and it has so many subcomponents. So these things were not there earlier. So these are the additions to the existing programs. If you have a look at the programs being run, I was doing a study on SDG 2, and I thought I should at least list the programs which are more or less directly or broadly connected with SDG 2, and I was under the wrong impression that I'll have a list running into say half a page or maybe 1 page. I ended up with a list of running into more than 8 pages. So there are so many programs, and these programs are being run by the states. States are the stakeholders. They are the most critical stakeholder in running any program. If you take the case of the nutrition mission, now the Anganwadi centers under integrated child development services are being run by the states. So we have been to many centers in last 2 months, and so that's one area. So far as funds are concerned, I do agree we need more funds. There is no doubt about that. But the marginal utility of the funds being spent should be so that people start calling that these are not being spent, these are rather being invested into nutrition or into roads like that, so that these pay back. You see, if you invest in road today, you may call it expenditure, but if you are saving or you have better quality of life in years to come, if you spend on nutrition and tomorrow people are healthier and they contribute back through their productivity, higher productivity, and then GNP goes up because of that element. So if you look at medium and long term, these are going to be of the nature of investments, and they will start paying back. Lastly, so far as jobs are concerned, there are definitely serious concerns, and parallelly advent of robots and robotics and 3D printing, these are also the issues. I was reading an article 2 days back that somebody was feeling maybe certain jobs will be taken over by machines or something like that, but the counter given by him was that today you have a query on regarding say you're operating your bank account and you have certain query with the banker. So tomorrow the big data will be very helpful, and you will need a human being again to have a look at that and process it so quickly, so that if you want to say broadly know what's the average rate of housing interest being charged by a bank, because nowadays you charge different rates for various reasons. So that kind of analysis it can give right up to the previous day, and suggest to the management that this is a number, you can give it to the customer today, and so like that. So that plus kick. And I'd been to one event recently, RS had sent me there, somebody had come from Turkey. I think the minister had come from Turkey, and he was speaking that today we are talking of jobs are not coming, jobs are being eaten. But what he said, that in next 15 years, we'll have more than 1/3 jobs, which we have not heard today, in the sectors, in the segments which we have not even heard today. So there are going to be more opportunities. We remember Y2K problem in 2000, that computers will crash and nothing will move. And then globally we all joined hands and came out of this, which is why I showed my slides on ozone hole. My idea is that it should not be that it's India's job, in China's job, USA's job. Idea is that these are the outcomes. If we all are working, if we all are measuring our indicators properly, if we are all truthfully adding up numbers, then those numbers should say that yes, global temperature has risen by say 0.5 or 7 or whatever, and ozone hole size has increased to like this. So these things will come, but I do totally agree with the third part of your question on jobs. It is the most critical element so far as India is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Hector, and I'm also with the NYU group. I'd like to see if you can identify any specific SDGs that India is currently struggling with, and what is the United Nations doing to be able to verify and make sure that India is on track to meeting them by 2030? Are there any timelines or any other measurements or procedures that are being put in place in order for India to be on track?
If you ask me to speak honestly, not on SDGs, but on its specific target, a target falling under SDG related to nutrition, 2.2. In that, the target itself says by 2025 to reduce stunting by this percentage and wasting by a certain percentage. Now, India is doing a lot to reduce wasting and stunting. But if I have a look at the data of 2005-06 on wasting, and it's a weight for height, wasting is weight for height, and of 2015-16 NFHS 4 survey, instead of improving, India's position has worsened. So if you ask me the biggest challenge, because if I see any problem, I'll first see that business as usual scenario is taking me to what level. Now the unfortunate part on this this fraction of this target is that my business as usual scenario is taking me in the direction which I am not designing. Of course, there are compatibility issues of the age of the children during that survey and age of the children during this survey, but we don't want to hide behind that fig leaf. And that is one area where UN bodies, health, WHO, we all are working together that at least we should reverse the trend. And we are at least grateful to the enumerators who brought it out. That you see, at times enumerators may be shy if they see the results are showing that things are worsening. How can, with so much of development, things can worsen? But yes, yeah, because if I'm talking in terms of say people suffering from say high blood pressure or diabetes, I know that maybe numbers are increasing. So if I encounter that kind of survey data when I'm doing any survey in the field, I don't mind. But on wasting, it's worsening, though by a small percent, but that's one area. But I think he would like to add to it what can be done.
Certainly. Very challenging question. But if I would have to identify one of the SDGs in which India needs to do better, I will certainly pick SDG 3. Sorry, SDG 5, that relates to gender equality. I think that there, in spite of the efforts, for example, the Beti Padao, Beti Bachao, the Save the Girl, Save the Child scheme is very important. A lot of efforts are being done to improve the situation, particularly of girls. I think the gaps are very, very wide still. Just to give you two pieces of data, about 30% of girls marry before 18 years of age in India. If you look at states which are the poorest states, like Rajasthan or Bihar. I think that's over 37% in both cases of girls marrying before the legal age. Certainly that really it has a tremendous implication in terms of the potential for sustainable development, because I think 1/2 of the population is not actively engaged in sustainable development. Another piece of data, relates, for example, to the issue of women's economic participation. I think India has one of the lowest economic participation of women in the economy. It's about 27% of the women that should be economically active are really engaged in economic activities. And again, that also hampers the possibility of India developing into the future. If you compare with other countries in the neighborhood, you find Sri Lanka, for example, where participation of women is about 60%. So in India, that's very low, and I think we need to, and particularly my agency works a lot in these areas that relate to gender equality, to really try to give women, particularly young women, empower them and give them opportunities to participate. So that's one. The other issue is not an SDG per se, although when we were discussing, there were many, sectors in the process of the SDGs formulation that were really aiming to have an SDG on youth. But I think for India it's crucial, because when we speak about employment, about education, about gender equality, we are really speaking about young people. And you probably have heard about the demographic dividend, a situation that happens only once in the country history, that you have the dependent population decreasing, waiting for the process that will come later, that will be an aging process. And India is also happening, it's happening very fast, the aging process, because of course the demographic transition. So I would say that although there's no SDG about young people, but I think that if you look at many SDGs, you will find that the critical population that should be considered, in nutrition, equality, economic, jobs, etc., education, health, etc., is young people. And I think India has the potential to really invest in those young people to be able to reach. Of course, it's a right issue. Young people should be given all the opportunities, particularly young women. But if India takes that advantage of the demographic situation of the country, which is a very young country, I think that the potential for India to grow in the future, not only economically, but socially, and also in terms of human rights and participation, that will be an amazing thing to do. And that's another area where UNFPA is working in India with the government, with the state governments, to really ensure that investments are really made in young people to be able to, profit from that very important demographic dividend that India has.
I think we need to close this session, and my apologies if you have further questions. We'll be very happy to take forward this conversation in the short break that we have. And thank you all for your patient hearing, and I thank both our very distinguished speakers for their time and very passionate presentation.
Of the SDGs, I thought that maybe you would like to, maybe I'll ask a question. What's the population of India as we speak?
So that's a great way to end this session, and thanks, sir.
Thank you.